Any citizen wishing to render comment, please step forward, state your name, your address, and limit your comments to 3 minutes. Come on up. At the podium. Excuse me? The podium, actually.
I'm Jarius Isaac. I live in 73rd Avenue Northeast in Kenmore. And I'm here because I really like what the planning, what's being suggested here with micro-housing and tiny homes. I have a friend right now that's working on a tiny home she's doing. And in these comments, it says the majority of the people that are doing tiny homes are younger people. That's probably true, but there's a lot of retired people that are single that are doing. This particular woman was in the tech field. She's going to probably spend about $100,000 building this house when it's done. And she wants to move it to Kenmore. So it looks beautiful. I've seen a couple stages of it. It's not going to be done for a couple months, but they're not an eyesore. If anything, they will enhance the property values. So as a real estate agent, I'm very aware of those as well. I've been an agent for 20 years in the area here. Myself, I'm working on a related kind of thing. I'm taking my property, and as you probably all know, 95% of the building that's going on by these builders, they're very conservative. So they build 2,000 to 2,400 square foot houses, 2 stories, on 4,000 square foot lots. And that's what you see. And I don't find in my real estate business that the majority of the people don't even want that. But that's all they can find if they want any new construction. So there's a lot of need out there for a lot of variation in the areas, and people are looking at the. There's a couple of meetup groups on Meetup.com. One of them's over 1,000 people that are in a tiny house because they're interested in tiny houses, and that's all people around here. So we're talking about a lot of people. So myself, I want to take my property in 73rd and develop it into a co-housing project, which I'm talking about with the planning department right now, which is another alternative. It's kind of like pocket neighborhoods with a community building, if any of you know what that is. We just need alternatives, and the regulations, I want to see the regulations changed to accommodate those type of situations, because we're not all vanilla here. It's just obvious. I mean, if you look around and talk to people, and I have to sell new houses to people that don't want them, that don't want those houses, but that's all they can find all the time. So,
all right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Next.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Doctor, and I live on 66th Court Northeast here in Kenmore, right on the edge of St. Edward's Park in McDonald Highlands. And I'm here with my wife, Joy. And I've got a question or sort of a concern. We've had people come to our house and do trimming of trees on our property. And there is a large tree, very, very large tree, right at the edge of our property. I think it's officially in St. Edward's Park, but that's pretty much my backyard, edges right up to it. And I want to know the possibilities if I were to have that tree removed, and how that might be done. I'm willing to pay for the costs of having it removed, but of course I want official permission to do that. Tree experts said that if that tree came down and there was a possibility that it would do some very serious and major damage to my home.
All right. Thanks, Jonathan. It might be a question for the city staff as opposed to the commission, but duly noted. Anybody else want to step up?
Ann Anderson, 16304, 81st Place, Northeast. It's an honor and privilege to be here. To have lived here in beautiful Kenmore for the past 3 years. All the tall trees really make me feel like I'm living full-time in my vacation home. I believe you should love thy neighbor tree. But now there's a real problem. The fast-moving new developments clear-cut beautiful old trees and don't give us back the same replacement trees. And now I realize you're working on the zoning. I would like to see replacement trees that are built to last. There's now no minimum height requirement of replacement trees in our Kenmore zoning. We need to change that. After having 35 trees planted in my 1/3 acre yard, I've learned a lot about trees and what will grow best. A minimum height, number, and type of replacement trees addresses the following issues. Quality of life. Please preserve Kenmore's beauty. A recent story in the Seattle Times reports lower class neighborhoods have less trees. So is this where Kenmore is heading? Wildlife. I live in the Morelands neighborhood off busy Simons Road, and we still have deer cutting through our backyards. Fewer trees will drive wildlife further away and affect our air and water quality. Please preserve old growth sites. Why cut down tall trees to develop ugly playgrounds dotted by miniature trees that no one plays in? Developers are mandated to build playgrounds, but more of them should be placed in old growth sites. Borders. Oh, I love border trees. Kenmore needs to plant borders of evergreen trees that will eventually grow 100 to 200 feet again in the next 100 years between new development neighborhoods with interlinking sidewalks. So then when we go on walks with our families, that we can cut through cul-de-sacs to play with neighborhood families. And then what about considering hiring a part-time arborist to give the city a better understanding of what trees will grow where and what is a good replacement tree standard? I was disappointed to hear the city does not have an arborist on staff. It shouldn't be a Kenmore citizen, it shouldn't be my job as a citizen to count trees and make sure developers plant 30 trees per acre instead of shrubs. The developers apparently don't know the difference between a tree and shrub and apparently don't care. So save us against erosion and landslides. I'm shocked that it's even a possibility that trees will be removed in landslide hazard areas. That has been established on map after map of King County. So we need to draw the line somewhere. We need to change the zoning to require a minimum height of trees. Now there's no minimum height for trees. There are no minimum quality standards. All I see are poor quality miniature trees in these new developments and dying shrub arborvitae. What about replacing the cut down 100 to 200 foot evergreens with trees that will grow to be the same height again in the next 100 years? Please require the builders to be accountable. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. Anybody else?
Evening. The returning Jim Dibble, 18750 63rd Avenue Northeast, Kenmore. I want to thank you for listening to my meandering comments last week. When I looked at the minutes, I didn't feel that they really relayed my intent. And so if it's okay with you, I just wanted to drop off what my field calls red lines, but at any rate, suggested inclusions into the planning paperwork. So
sure.
If I may, can I just...
You have one for everyone, or?
I do, actually.
Okay.
There's just two sentences in red if you have any questions.
All right. Thanks, Jim.
You betcha.
Okay. All right. I think that's everybody, but if I missed anybody, I invite you now to come on up and render comment. All right. We've satisfied that element of the agenda. Next item on the agenda is approval of the July 7, 2015 minutes. Do I hear a motion to approve? The minutes?
I move that we approve the minutes.
Do I hear a second? Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say nay. Any abstentions? Motion carries. The minutes are approved. Next item on the agenda is tree windthrow amendments continued. I invite city staff, including the Director of Community Development, to step forward and render counsel.
Good evening, Planning Commission. So we're here to continue the discussion about tree windthrow, which is the topic related to amendments, or potential amendments to the tree regulations, and that's the limited scope of what you're considering. So your last meeting, Ashley McCulley presented a staff recommendation for how to address windthrow for new developments, and you asked some questions, clarifications, and wanted to bring back some information, and we have that information in your agenda packet, and also a recommendation for how to address windthrow on single-family lots. So I'm going to turn it over to Ashley, and she's going to step through the information.
Thank you. So last week's meeting, we discussed amending Chapter 18 to address tree windthrow. And after our discussion, there were some questions that were raised that we went back as a team and discussed and found some answers. One of the first questions was, how are we defining a qualified tree protection professional to assess tree windthrow? And in Chapter 18, Section 20, a qualified tree protection professional is defined as a licensed professional with academic and or field experience that makes her or him a recognized expert in tree preservation and management. The tree protection professional may be an arborist certified by the International Society of Arboriculture, or an arborist registered with the American Society of Consulting Arborists, and have specific experience in Washington State on tree management. One of the other questions that was raised or seeking clarification on was the current process for tree removal on single-family lots and prices for permitting and assessment costs. Anytime a single-family homeowner wants to remove a tree from their lot, they fill out a Form 303 checklist, which has been provided for you guys to look at in the attachments. And they go through the checklist and put down the number of trees they want, where they're located on their property, and then what size their lot is, which signals how many trees can be taken down per year. And Development Services uses this to review it, and from there they will assess if they need a permit or not. And the Form 303 is tracked and kept on file just so the city knows, even if a permit isn't required, how many trees are being removed, so they can keep track of a quota. If a permit is required, for example, a critical area, a tree assessment may be required. The cost for a tree assessment arborist report depends on the extent of information requested and size of the property. We've contacted a few consulting firms around the area who specialize in, who have licensed arborists who come out to the site and assess the trees you want to be removed. And the average rate is $70 to $100 per hour, depends on their experience and expertise. And that includes a visit to the site, them returning to their office and writing a protection plan, and then sending that to the person requesting the report. The arborists say it's anywhere from about 2 to 3 hours they average bill out to people requesting protection plans. If a permit is required for tree removal, the permit fee is $75.71. In the case of a hazard tree needing immediate removal, the homeowner does not have to wait for the city's permission. The tree can be removed immediately, and then the checklist provided after the fact.
Hey, Ashley.
Yeah.
So if I could interject here. So if somebody calls a tree removal service, an arborist, says, hey, I'd like to remove this tree, did they typically take care of all the permitting, the 303 and
The arborist or the
arborist?
No.
Because most homeowners don't look it up before they have a tree cut.
No, Form 303 is for any resident of Kenmore to fill out if they want to remove a tree. It's not requiring a permit. It's mainly as kind of like a screening process for the city to kind of keep track of how many trees are being removed, and if a permit is required, then they would follow through with permit procedures. But that's up to the resident, and then they would contact an arborist if like something more extensive needed to be done than just applying or submitting the checklist.
But what I'm asking is, do you know if the arborists typically inform the homeowner that they have to fill out 303 or assist them with that? Because my experience is most homeowners don't know that there is a 303. And they don't know that there's a permit requirement. And they call Bartlett, for example, which is right down here on the corner, and they say, hey, I got this tree. It's dying, whatever the reason. I'd like it removed. Does Bartlett or whoever the arborist is know about this? Do they communicate with the city?
Oftentimes they'll just say it's up to the homeowner to comply with any local permitting requirements. I know when these regulations went into effect, there was sort of a huge sort of education out there to sort of let homeowners know, hey, the rules have changed, here's what the new rules are. And I think over the years there have been sort of reminders out there, then here's a reminder about tree removal. And so it seems to have been sort of pretty much self-regulating, that if neighbors see somebody taking down a bunch of trees, they'll often call and say, hey, my neighbor's taking down a bunch of trees. Are they allowed to do that? Do they have a permit to do that? So that's often how we hear, or sometimes people are out in the field from the city and see trees being cut down. But again, it's sort of an education process, so maybe it's time to put some more information out on the website or in the newsletter or something, and especially if we're going to be making any additional amendments, that's probably another good opportunity to sort of have a reminder about what the city's rules and regulations are about tree removal.
But don't you think it might be more efficient to tell the arborists, because they're in the business? They keep up with these things. They have to keep up with these things. It sounds like they disclaim liability and they say, hey, it's up to the homeowner. We're washing our hands. If they complied, great. If they didn't, not our fault. But I think most homeowners kind of would expect or hope that the arborist would fill them in on this kind of thing. I will say that I've had improvements done to my house, and the contractor, the heating tank guy will say, you got to get a permit for this. Either you take care of it or we'll take care of it. So I wonder, is that something the city might consider, is contacting local tree removal firms and saying, hey, we'd like you to let owners know when you get contacted about 303 and
It is certainly something we could look into. We can also kind of chat with development services and see that, when a permit's required, they can maybe kind of note if there was an arborist report to see who sort of in the business locally that we could contact and get the word out. So it's certainly an option.
Strikes me as more efficient, perhaps. But go ahead, Ashley. Go ahead.
All right. One of the other questions was to explain the regulations for tree removal and protection in critical areas like wetlands and steep slopes. Critical areas and wetlands fall into tree protection priorities as defined in Chapter 18. So in critical areas such as steep slopes and wetlands, a tree removal permit and arborist assessment are currently required. Healthy trees generally must be retained in these areas, particularly if they're located in already established critical area protective tracts. One of the other questions that was addressed was if Public Works or Development Services has any regulations in regards to tunneling versus trenching, and what the city, if they do or do not require a specific method. In talking with development services and engineering and environmental services, there is currently no to-date required method for utilities. And one of the last questions was what options are available to adjoining property owners to receive notification on how, if a tree is coming down that neighbors them that could potentially harm them. With subdivision or other projects requiring a land use permit, neighbors receive notice of the application and have an opportunity to comment on all aspects of the project, including tree preservation. However, in single-family tree removal permits, there's no opportunity for public input. And part of that is because there's no permitting required, and they're allowed removal of so many significant trees per year. Moving forward, I would first like to address the regulations and amendments we proposed to Chapter 18.57 Tree Management Protection last week, or 2 weeks ago at the July 7th meeting. These amendments with some minor revisions were attached with the packet. At this time, staff is not recommending any additional changes to the proposed amendments. If the Commission does not have any additional changes, these amendments will be presented at a public hearing to City Council in September. So before I start talking about our new recommendations, continuing this conversation and addressing the gap we had discussed at the July 7th hearing, I'm asking if there are any questions to the 18.57 amendments.
Mike?
Yes, one quick. Overall, I like your suggestions. I certainly support one of the issues that I did, problems I did have, I was trying to map back from your narrative to the actual changes to the regulation. And one of the key ones, at least my interest, was staff in your narrative. It says staff recommends that if a wind throw assessment is prepared, neighboring property owners would be alerted to this issue through a one-page form letter, blah, blah, blah. I don't see that in the actual language of the regulation. Is that something that needs to be added, or?
In the amendment language, was that in the original memo from
Yes,
the narrative from 2 weeks ago?
The original memo of July 15th.
Sorry, I'm looking at it.
See it, right?
Well, if you look at it first in the memo, it's right here in the memo at the very end before the attachment list.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. I see that there, and I think that's good, but I don't see it in the actual regulation.
Yeah. Can you point out where that recommendation is actually highlighted
In the new one?
Because you've got chapter 18 and 15 sections, but we don't see where you put that addition.
I think it might have been removed on accident. It was definitely in the review section for staff to evaluate. That can easily be added back in when we recommend it to council.
Can we see
Should we-
that complete amended language then at some point?
Mm-hmm.
Before we vote on it?
Yeah, that was in the first one.
Mike, are you done, or do you want to add anything?
Yeah, 11.
Okay. Mark?
Yeah, I had a question on, looks like section B here on attachment 5, it looks like the third sentence, it talks about the assessment also shall evaluate increased wind throw potential for trees on neighboring lots, so they're within 50 feet of the closest trees being removed on the site. So first question is, how did you arrive at 50 feet?
That was part of the research in looking at urban forest management best practices, and in working with the Washington State Department of Natural Resources suggests the 50 feet perimeter.
Okay, so it's a state kind of guideline or recommendation?
Yeah, best practice guideline.
Practice, okay. And just a little follow-up question. So, so they evaluate the wind throw potential on neighboring lots. So does that bring in any requirements for those trees on neighboring lots then? Does this bring, I'm just wondering what the sort of consequences would be of evaluating the potential on the neighboring lots.
So the idea was that if you have a tree on the perimeter of your property or close to the perimeter, the 50 feet is, if that 50 feet falls within a neighboring property, then you're assessing if it will affect any of their trees and looking at if they share a root system and other potential risk factors. But it would not be looking at, an arborist would not go onto a neighbor's property and then assess those trees. They're looking at the trees on the specific lot or site in question, and if there would be an effect on the neighbors from that point.
Okay, so the neighbors wouldn't be under any obligation necessarily to do anything?
No.
Okay, just wanted to clarify that. Thanks.
Anybody else? Go ahead, Deborah.
And I'm a little unclear, maybe we just addressed that with the earlier comment, but isn't there I don't know if the action plan is the one that we have for the single-family neighborhoods? I thought it was just more of a simple permit.
That was the third part to this, where we were trying to amend Chapter 15 in the single lot removal. 18.57 was addressing subdivisions and large plots for development.
Right. Yeah. So on the single-family, when they want to remove trees more than they can do without a permit, in other words, where it triggers a permit, would there be a way to notify the neighbors in that situation as well? I mean, that it's kind of the same issue.
Yes, I believe for consistency purposes, it would all be tied together.
Okay.
Should a winter issue be in place.
Okay. Okay, and then the other totally unrelated comment. So the tree professional, there's language in there, it talks about the professional may be certified by...
They're required to be either certified with the International Society of Arboriculturists or registered with the American Society of Consulting Arborists.
Okay, maybe we just need to tighten the language then, because I think in the actual language it's permissive as opposed to requirement. I think it says may as opposed to shall. So anyway, it's just something to check.
Yeah, I think the may was defining, saying it could be one or the other, and then the requirement was that it's one or the other, and then they shall also have experience in Washington State with tree management. But we can
I think we
touch
just
up
want
the
to make
language.
sure that it's a shall be an arborist that's, registered or certified with one of those too. So, because that's come up a couple times.
Can I make a comment too? I actually...
Wait, whoa. Did you complete your
Well, yeah,
comment?
I think we got it, right? Are we? Yeah.
Yeah. You would prefer it read, the tree protection professional shall be an arborist certified by the...
There you go.
Blah, blah, blah. Right, so it's just changing the may to a shall.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right, yeah.
That's good. And it should be noted that those requirements stated in that part of the regulation, if you look up what an International Society of Arborists requirements are to have that piece of certification and be a member of that society, it actually requires quite a lengthy process for them to be awarded that certificate. So it's good that it says shall be either this professional or that professional. Both of those certifications do have extensive training, like additional schooling and years of experience. So it's really to the benefit of our community that that kind of a tree protection specialist is chosen, not just somebody who's, been with a landscape company or, done tree work. It really does need to be somebody who knows the health of trees and understands the biology of trees.
Anybody else? Mike?
Question, the 3034, who fills that out today? Is that the homeowner?
The homeowner, yes.
Is there any requirement that that be reviewed or signed off by the arborist?
No, the homeowner is for development services to track tree removal and or establish whether or not a permit is required or a tree protection plan is required. From there, if either of those is required, the permit fee's paid, they can remove the trees, and then they're tracked. If a tree protection plan is required or triggered, then that information is sent with the applicant to the arborist.
I'm just wondering if the city is going to rely on the 303 to tell it whether or not there's an issue that needs to be resolved. If that continues to be a self-report item by the homeowner or the developer, wouldn't this be a bit stronger if that was actually cross-signed or actually that was the work of the arborist to complete that form?
That's a good point.
Well, the arborist would only need to complete that form if a wind throw assessment is required. So are you saying then that regardless, an arborist should be required to fill out this form? That seems a little onerous.
So maybe I have the timing wrong. So the 303 is, when is a 303 required?
It's a screening process, so it's required when homeowners of a single-family lot want to remove a tree, and they fill out the checklist. If it's in a critical area, it requires a tree protection plan. It kicks in the tree protection plan because it's a protected area. If the lot is a certain size and they want to remove more trees than they're allotted per year, then a permit is required. As I'm about to get into the next section, if tree wind throw were to be added, it would go onto that form, and then a variety of risk factors would be provided, and if any of those risk factors were present, it would require the applicant to consult an arborist to assess for wind throw. So 303 is, as it stands now, and would continue to be a screening form.
So I think I do understand this. So what we're saying is today, the way this works is that the property owner, whether that's an individual or a developer, self-reports whether or not they think there is an issue. Correct. And if they think there's an issue, then an arborist is brought in. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes. Yeah, they fill out the form, they submit it to the city, and then there's sort of a determination if an arborist needs to be involved.
So,
and we're still talking about, we haven't gone over the proposal, we're sort of jumping around a little bit, so.
all right. Mark, did you?
Go ahead, you were going to follow up on Mike, I'll follow you.
Okay. And there's a little jumping going on, but there's a lot to take on, and we all have different emphases. Jim, I can't call on you now. Maybe another meeting, or maybe you want to render comment later, but I've got to proceed through the agenda at this point. But one of the questions I see in the minutes that was raised, and I think I raised it, was provide information, if available, about the number of wind throw incidents documented in Kenmore or any specific wind throw risks for particular areas of Kenmore. And I raised that because I remember in the original memo, it sounded like wind throw regulations are very rare. And a couple of the cities that have wind throw regulations are in very high wind intensive areas, Bandon, Oregon, which is on the Pacific Ocean, and Port Townsend, which is on the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And I'm kind of wondering why Kenmore is considering itself in that category of cities that needs wind throw regulations, which do impose some burdens on homeowners. I mean, I understand wind throw, is a legitimate concern, but are we really in that category? So that's one reason I asked, and I didn't see an answer to that in the materials tonight.
I don't think we have any sort of hard and fast data. We are aware of a couple of incidents where there were trees have fallen. It looks like wind throw was the culprit when trees were cleared on one property and caused a tree to fall on a neighbor, but we don't have haven't kept a count of those, but we do know that they're there. And so knowing that there is an issue, how you kind of quantify the the level of risk is hard to do because, as Ashley pointed out at the last meeting, that can be sort of environmentally related, whether it's a storm or it can be related to sort of a human action, if you like, of somebody cutting a tree down. So it's hard to assess what the overall risk is for Kenmore. We know there is a risk.
But is there a greater risk in Kenmore than there are in the vast majority of cities that don't have these regulations?
I don't know if that's, you can kind of say that just because other cities don't have it, that they're not concerned about it. I mean, I don't know how to make that comparison.
Well, is it fair to say that there are very few cities that have these regulations?
I wouldn't say there's very few.
I saw 4 in the last memo that covered the Pacific Northwest.
I chose them because they had a lot of the best practices in terms of what cities, how tight the regulations are. Other cities broadly address wind throw and include it in tree protection, and it might simply say keep trees wind firm, or they'll have some of the same measurements, or you might see the word wind throw once or twice in the ordinance, but it's not uncommon for cities to have some sort of wind throw protection. Trees are widely known to have a domino effect, and when something happens to one, it can affect others that are interlinked to it. Cities definitely have these ordinances. The ones were chosen for the memo to highlight how far regulation can go, or how a city can intervene as a best practice to kind of specifically discuss it, but keep it pretty broad at the same time. They were really looked at more of examples of regulations versus just the only 4 cities that are doing it.
So it sounds like when I look at some of these amendments, I see if there's any risk or any increased risk of tree wind throw, then they have to go through this process for satisfying the city regarding whether the tree can be removed or how it can be removed, right? There's not really a measure of what's the risk. It's, hey, some wind throw force might be created by this removal of this tree.
Yes.
And it triggers the full panoply of regulations. One of my concerns, and I brought it up last time, was, is there any balance between the burden on the homeowner and the benefit of the regulation? And I'm sorry, there's a benefit to the neighbor, but there's a burden on the homeowner, and there's also benefits to removing trees on occasion. So, sunlight, view, we're a city with a lot of views, but the presumptions are one-sided. They're all in favor of they seem to be tree protection. I'm seeing not just in the wind throw proposals, but in the rest of the legislation regarding tree density, tree preservation. All the policies are in that direction, but there doesn't seem to be any language about some of the benefits of tree removal. And one of my concerns is we're looking at one part of a bigger issue, urban forestry, and there's only one, it seems to me, one side of the argument being presented here. And I think we're being asked to make decisions without the benefit of the other side of the argument, and we're taking one element of this bigger issue and focusing solely on it. And my sense is this might be something better addressed in an overall review of an urban forestry policy. Not just take wind throw and say, let's look at that in isolation. But those are my comments. Mark?
Well, I just want to follow, maybe from a Littleton direction. When the city council, asked us to look at this, did they give you any guidance or give any indication why this kind of rose to their interest in having us consider it?
I think they were aware of I mean, I think maybe they'd heard from their constituents complaints about wind throw, and so they felt that, because it had been an issue that had been brought forward to them, they asked staff to take a look and see if it's something that should be included in the tree management and protection. And you're right, the tree management and protection, as sort of the name implies, is really to sort of manage how you protect trees. But the tree wind throw issue has sort of also a broader issue of, safety, protecting life and property, because if you don't consider that, then the downside would be, potentially then a wind throw then would cause, damage to property. So that would be the other issue rather than just protecting trees in the environment. And the other long list of reasons for why it's good to protect trees when you can.
Well, isn't that part of the tree hazard policy? We've got a policy already saying, and I assume encouraging people to remove trees that present a hazard of imminent injury or damage. Doesn't that include the risk of wind throw? The risk that the wind might have a bearing on the hazard potential?
Well, I think a hazard tree is a little bit different than wind throw.
I think a hazard tree is defined as like a decaying tree that somebody can look at it and the roots are already coming out, or you can tell there's a potential threat. It's towering a certain height, it's leaning. Wind throw mitigation is about certain activities that occur can create hazard trees for no significant reason other than to develop or clear land. And the difference between protections to remove hazardous trees and then trying to prevent more hazardous trees or situations from being put in place.
But my understanding is that the safety issue can already be addressed and should be addressed by any homeowner who has a tree that has a risk of falling, whether it's by wind or by decay or anything else, steep slope.
I think the difference is being reactive versus proactive, and the current tree hazard policy in place is a reactive one. Something's already happened, this tree's a hazard, can I remove it? They're allowed to without a permit. The wind throw ordinance would be trying to mitigate future trees getting to that level of hazard or risk.
Okay. This is one reason, and I'll get to you, Deborah.
It's for me.
Thanks for your patience. I think it ought to be viewed in a broader context because I think they overlap. If we're talking about safety, we've already got some safety regulations. We already know about hazard trees, and this is overlapping with that. So I think a more efficient way to review this would be in that broader context. Deborah, thanks for your patience.
Well, it's tied in with your comment. I think a key, unless I'm misunderstanding, a key distinction between this and the hazard trees is the hazard trees are already decaying or problematic. I mean, what we're talking about here is removal of healthy trees that by removal of those might endanger other things. It might cause a domino effect, but it's I think this really is quite distinct. But I would absolutely agree that I would prefer if we had the authority, which I don't know if we do from the council, to look at the broader ordinance, because I would also like to revisit the issue of views and, the flip side of removal of trees. So, yeah.
Construction.
Yeah.
Tree litter.
But I don't know if we have that authority, so.
And that would be one thing right now you could add to your docket along with the ones that you've already identified, and I think views and trees were one of them. So you could kind of broaden that suggestion for the docket.
Mark, I don't know if you had a chance to finish your comments.
Yeah, I did on that. I had a more discreet one on the neighboring property owners, but I want to finish this discussion first.
Well, I think I've said my piece. There's some hands up over here. I don't know who was first. Carol, you want to go?
Well, I wonder if we can make a recommendation to the council that we reviewed this topic and your amendments, and the amendments that you're recommending are reasonable. But in the process of doing this discussion, we also realize that maybe we should be reviewing wind throw in a greater overall urban forest package so that it doesn't just get, narrowed down to this. But yeah, I can see that as being a possibility as part of our process.
Well, in fact, maybe we could, and I'm sorry to interrupt because, Mike, I know you're waiting, but maybe this is something we could send back on a sort of, I don't know what our timeline is for responding, what the council expects for our response to this proposal, this docket item. But maybe before we go more deeply into it, we could propose to the council that instead of continuing this, there is concern that this is better and more efficiently addressed as part of a broader urban forestry policy. And then we wouldn't get to the end of it and say, hey, we have these big concerns, but here's what we think, by, to the extent we've addressed it. And instead, they may agree that it's more efficiently dealt with in the broader context of trees generally and urban forestry. And then we all save time and have a more broad, comprehensive proposal when we take up the broader issue next year or some other time.
I think if you're going to do that, you'd need to kind of figure out what issues you would want to address with urban forestry, because I think that it could include many things, and I think this particular issue was sort of a one defined issue, and what you're saying is we understand it's a defined issue and we want to make it a really big issue. Council, are you okay with us doing that? I think that's what you're asking.
That's not quite how I'd put it, but I see where you're coming from, and I'd be happy to propose language, the response language to the council, and have everybody here tinker with it as we have done in the past.
So I think if that's the approach you want to take, then we were on a path. I think we were currently thinking we were on a path as bringing forward amendments on this one particular issue, seeing if the Planning Commission wanted to move forward with the amendments to address Windthrow for development and single family, and then if that was the case, then hold a public hearing in September and then give a recommendation to council. If you're not ready for that approach, it sounds like you would want to kind of schedule a study session or be part of a business agenda with the council and give a status update of where you are and ask council for direction. Do you want us to continue on this path and address this one particular issue, or would you like us to hold it and address it as part of a broader scope for urban forestry that would include items, whatever those items might be?
Right. Or would it be more efficient for us just to endorse a statement rather than have a joint meeting and say, here's our concern, we think it's part of a bigger issue, we think they overlap. Some of us are concerned that there's a lack of balance in the policy proposals that might apply to other urban forestry issues as well. It could be as simple as a paragraph or two, and let them respond to that before we convene and jointly meet and the whole bit.
I don't know how to do that and get the council's direction on that without having the council do that in a public forum.
Yeah, submit the proposal, the statement to them as part of a future council agenda item.
Talk about it.
Does that make sense?
Totally.
Mike, you've been very patient.
Thank you. This is a common frustration we've had in the past on other subjects of being compartmentalized into a small segment of a much larger issue, and we've struggled and had to balance that out on a lot of other issues. And I've shared some of your feeling that we're missing out something here. But at the same time, I think we do have a very discrete issue here, particularly related to the single family, that we can take some action on. And I'd hate to see us lose the opportunity to do that. I think if we were to approve these amendments, to go ahead with this and then move into a public forum and a public meeting where we could get that kind of feedback, that I think would probably support that wider view. This would actually be helpful to the eventual goal that I think you're looking for, Doug, which is to widen this discussion out and to have that discussion.
My concern is, Mike, and I appreciate your comments, I think they're good ones. My concern is we redo it. We come to this proposal, we've analyzed it, we give it to them, we say, we think this has a bearing on a lot of other urban forestry issues too. As I've said, I've got reservations about looking at perhaps just one side of this argument already, so I would probably be inclined against adopting these proposals just for that reason, but I do think it's a legitimate concern. I do think it should be factored in to some degree if there's balance. So I don't want to redo everything. I just think we say, hey, can we put this on hold until we take on the bigger issue? And then we have a consistent policy, not just for Windthrow, but for the rest of urban forestry.
And that does, if you just think about it from a common sense point of view, yes, we want to address this, because if we get a big windstorm in October and there's lots of personal property damage, and we've tabled putting things in place that would help property owners manage the trees on their property and protect trees in the urban forest, we might save everybody a lot of heartache because those policies would be in place. I do think that safety's got to be the big thing over keeping as many trees as possible. And how to move forward, since I'm newer on the council, it is helpful to hear that there's been other issues that, get pushed to the council or the planning commission to review and strategize and then bring back what those recommendations are, hold a public hearing, and then have the council move forward with actually making the laws. So,
well, that's kind of the process.
I know.
How it works,
I can see that.
Mike?
At the risk of restating, I think this is another one of those change management, times are changing issues. We are heavily treed for most of the cities. We are still heavily treed. Many people value them. People have a right to be able to choose their property in different ways. We're going to have to change. There are trees that are going to come down. We're going to need to make those decisions as we go along. My concern is that we have no real good rules for doing that. And I would, as in other cases, I prefer to have a way to manage that change in a deliberate way than just let it happen. And this, I do disagree with you on this, Doug. I think in this particular issue, we do have a pretty discreet proposal out there. I don't see a lot of unintended consequences. I don't see a lot of balance. What I see here is a way for property owners, not just developers, to have a way to understand what's going to happen to trees and what their rights and privileges are. And that's why I would support this. I don't think that is going to unbalance anybody else's right. In fact, I think this is probably creates more security and more assurity for the developer or the property owner who wants to take a tree down, that they'll know there's a process out there. And it gives the city a way to be able to deal with that issue in advance. And we know that this has failed in the past.
Deborah, I'm going to respond, and I appreciate that. Go ahead, Deborah.
I agree with Mike. I think this could be a both-and kind of thing. I think we do have some pretty clear direction that we could move on with the Windthrow issue, and it is a safety issue, and I don't see any reason why we couldn't move forward on that. And yet, I mean, even in this citizen comment today, when we only have a few people, there's been multiple issues that go beyond the scope of this that have already been raised. So I think we have some pretty firm grounding to say, yeah, let's move on this. But, City Council, we would also like to clearly take up the broader issues, and we've only heard a little bit of them. And I don't know how to get more input on what those issues are.
I think about the homeowner, and he's got a tree. And people usually cut down trees for a reason, right? It's not just, I hate trees. It's rarely the case. There would be far fewer trees now than there are. But let's say they have a beautiful view of the lake or the mountains, and they think, I'd really like to cut down this tree. And the tree is near neighboring trees. And if there is an even infinitesimal increase in windthrow risk created, apparently that tree has to stay. So there's no balancing of, okay, here's this great benefit that could be provided by this tree versus the infinitesimal increase in risk of windthrow to the neighboring property. And so there's no weighing going on. It's just any risk of windthrow means that...
How much risk, I guess, is it? I mean,
well, I agree. I think these things should be measured. There could be other reasons to cut down the tree. You know, maybe there's a couple of trees that block all the shade to the house or block all the sunlight to the house. Or maybe their trees are in the way, and this is going to be typically the case when somebody wants to build a house on a lot. They're in the exact wrong place for building the house efficiently, and we're all worried about affordable housing. And if you make it that much harder or more expensive to build a house, it's going to go against a citywide concern for affordable housing. I'm just saying that's not even in here. None of that's even in here. So I kind of like to hear those other comments and that other policy perspective before we make a conclusive decision on windthrow is always bad, got to do everything we can to cut it out. Anybody else? Mark?
I actually agree with Mike and Deborah on this. I think this can be the spur to hopefully, a larger conversation. And I'm hoping those kind of issues will come out in, the public hearing and further consideration. I think those are all very legitimate concerns. But from a I guess from a process and a standpoint of trying to, address the sort of the safety and other sort of imminent issues, I guess I would support the approach of trying to move through with this and again, having that be a kind of a spur to, I think, the larger conversation that we all agree should happen, so.
All right. Anybody else? Okay, so we are at, I don't think you got to finish, Ashley. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
We were just going to basically talk about the process of tree removal for single-family lots. And as I had mentioned, step one would be adding a checklist to Form 303. If wind throw is a risk factor or two is present, it would require the applicant to hire an arborist to assess if there is risk, the level of risk to should that tree be removed. The last section I had added, as you can see in the memo, outlines pretty much the process of adding to Form 303, and then the amendments would be, right now it's highlighted in Section 25 of Chapter 15, exceptions for clearing and tree removal. We would add, after saying that tree removal cannot occur without a protection plan in a critical area, we would add and would not increase the likelihood of tree wind throw. See Chapter 18, Section 57, what we had just discussed in length. And essentially, if the amendments we added for Chapter 18 would go into effect if significant trees on single-family lots were at risk for wind throw too. We feel that adding this and including the single-family lot closes that gap of, just because it's a single-family lot doesn't mean removal of significant trees on those lots don't bear a risk either. And so I really just, where I was going to wrap up with was amending Chapter 15, Section 25 to include a process for screening for single-family lots to make the policy more consistent, and hopefully move with that to council and public hearing in the fall.
Okay, is that it?
Yes.
Anybody want to make a motion?
I'll make a motion to approve the recommendations of staff.
Do I hear a second?
I'll second.
All right, further discussion? Okay, all in favor say aye.
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 All against say nay. We have 2 nays. How many ayes? Can you raise your hands again? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, any abstentions?
I'll abstain.
Okay, and 1 abstention. So the motion carries. I do want to add that my nay is based on concerns about balance, about input on the side in favor of potentially measuring the risk and measuring the benefit of keeping a tree, and the desire to have this issue be addressed as part of a broader urban forestry review. Okay, if anybody else wants to comment on their vote, I invite that too. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, this is maybe goes beyond a comment on the vote. I was going to actually offer a motion that we adopt a request to the City Council that they put a wider review of tree management and forest management on our docket for the next session.
Okay, do I hear a second?
I'll second that.
Okay, further discussion? None? Okay, all in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say nay. Any abstentions? Motion carries.
Thank you.
All right, I think that satisfies that element of the agenda. Next item on the agenda is microhousing and tiny houses.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ashley.
Sorry, thank you.
Welcome back, Lori. Are you going to lead us on this topic?
I am going to lead you on this topic after my 2 hours in the car to get here from Seattle.
Transit now. 522 transit now.
So I sound a little disoriented, I am.
Can I just apologize for being late? I don't know if Lori told you guys, but as I was stuck on Lake City Way for about 2 hours, I heard the police officer say that a random tree fell on the electrical line and downed it. Yeah, so I'm like, how appropriate, since we're talking about Windthrow.
It must have been Windthrow.
It was a hazard tree.
It was a hazard. So they need.
Does every tree that falls fall because of Windthrow? And if it falls and nobody hears it?
Yes.
People heard this one.
So, Doug, could I ask for just a minute to
Please.
get my PowerPoint up here?
Take your time. So we should all put up our monitors?
Yes,
Okay.
that would be great. Right. Why is our mouse not working? Here we go. Oh, I'm supposed to do that. Okay. Guess the mouse isn't on. It's being modified by D. Bent. All right. I'm Miracle.
Yes.
Okay, so good evening, Planning Commissioners. Today I am going to be introducing a new topic, and what we're hoping for this evening is just some sort of general direction from the Planning Commission about whether you're interested in, there are sort of two approaches to this topic. It was prompted actually by a couple of requests from the development community to build microhousing, and then also from at least one private request to site a tiny house on a lot in Kenmore. So the issue was timely. We took it forward to the City Council and said, this is coming up. Do you want to add it to the docket? And they agreed that for 2015 that they should go before the Planning Commission and at least have some initial discussions. So what is microhousing? I think my packet did a pretty good job of describing it, but we're looking at two different types. Microhousing apartments. These are small apartments, generally less than about 350 square feet in size. Some of them include partial kitchens. The kitchen features vary. Some don't include kitchens at all. They're basically akin to dorm rooms around a common shared kitchen area. The other thing we're going to be looking at is tiny houses, and these are very small standalone houses that may be on a trailer with wheels and have RV utility hookups. The act of putting them on wheels has a couple different purposes. One is to make them mobile and transportable, but the other one is to avoid code regulations that prohibit siting them if they're of a certain small size on a piece of property. That's a building code requirement. So I included a couple more pictures. There were a lot in your packet. You can see here, one thing I did note in the packet is that development, the building of microhousing is often per square foot more expensive because they really get into these efficiency features. I mean, some of them are really carefully designed. This one, you can see the Murphy bed that drops down. Here's the small refrigerator. It looks like a microwave. This one may also have a stove. This is a building in Seattle, and that is, these have 200 to 300 square foot units. A podment is probably a term you've heard, and you may have followed the controversy in Seattle over this. This was from an article in the Seattle Times. This woman is living in a project called Alder Flats, a microhousing apartment. She's a nurse, and this Alder Flats project on Capitol Hill is very close to her business, place of business. Here are some tiny houses. This one is 196 square feet. You can see that the wheels are here. They're covered. This one is in Boise, Idaho. It's actually inhabited by a couple. The article said that they built it themselves, but the cost was about $11,000. Cost is another issue for microhousing. Most microhousing that people build is less than $100,000. So it is a cost savings because it's so small, even though the per square footage cost may be higher. Here's someone, they often have loft sleeping areas. And then this is one that was done by the Tumbleweed Tiny House Company. They're known for their little tiny houses. This is 310 square feet. If you want it as a studio version, it could go up to 404 square feet if you were to put a bedroom at the back. So again, they have basically a great room, a kitchen, maybe an office kind of a space, a multi-use space, and the sleeping facilities may either be on some sort of a convertible sofa or a Murphy bed, something like that. So the city's current approach to microhousing is that microhousing apartments, so those apartments, are regulated as multiple family dwelling units. Unlike City of Seattle, our code definition of a multifamily unit says that it may or may not include a kitchen, so that there was not an issue of interpreting that these small units, even if they did not include a kitchen, were independent dwelling units, and so that's how they're being regulated. If you have a site-built tiny house, you put it on a foundation, post and pier, however you build it, but if you build it on the site, you have to comply with the same rules as any other dwelling, and that's where the building code restrictions on minimum sizes come into play. So tiny houses on wheels are regulated as recreational vehicles under our current code. It doesn't quite fit, but that is the closest definition that Development Services could come to. There aren't restrictions on size for recreational vehicles. However, there are restrictions on how long a recreational vehicle can be sited on a lot or whether it can be used as an accessory dwelling unit. And I might mention, I wanted to call out in the packet that the question of minimum size was actually taken up by the Washington State Legislature this year. The bill made it all the way through. It was a combined bill that got into the third session. As far as I know, it didn't go forward, but it will be docketed and would come forward again in the next session. That bill would have eliminated those minimum size requirements, and it was tiny house advocates, I think, that promoted that bill. It really is a thing, I have to say. The more I researched it, the more I realized that there's actually quite an avid community for these tiny house dwellings. So in the packet, I mentioned that there are a couple of approaches that the Planning Commission could recommend. One would be to do minimal code changes. In other words, we'd regulate it the way it has been regulated, but we would make clear what those rules are. And I suppose you could tweak the question of whether a tiny house could be an accessory dwelling unit. That would be a pretty minimal code change. The other approach would be to do some more extensive code changes directly addressing this type of housing, and perhaps setting out special rules maybe related to parking or other features. The issue that I would see would be if there were concerns about neighborhood compatibility or issues of density, although if we're considering microhousing apartment units, individual units, it would be the same density rules as in any other circumstance. So I have some slides about the issues for more extensive amendments, but I'd be interested to know whether the Planning Commission has a preliminary view on these two options, whether, if we wanted to make the code clear about them. In some ways you could incentivize them
we would look at a more complicated set of rules. If in fact we will say, yes, these things exist, but they're regulated just like any other dwelling unit in Kenmore, then we could do this more minimal set of code changes.
So you're asking us to choose between the two approaches that you had on the previous screen?
Right. Let
Can
me
you go back
go
to
back
that?
to that. Right there. And you may have questions too about the memo or the contents of the memo or general
Any
questions.
comments at this point, Mike?
Question. As I was thinking about this and reading about it in other instances long before this, watching what's happening down in Seattle, I understand the economics in Seattle, in a dense urban area where you have very high property values, and so you can build these small units, and I understand how that can become advantageous for the developer as well as for the person who's looking for that type of housing. I'm having a hard time understanding it, though, in the context of Kenmore. And particularly when you answered one of my first questions, the first one I was going to ask, which is how do these units, particularly the apartment type of thing, how do they work against the current zoning rules? So if the density requirements don't change, and I'm a developer, why would I choose to build an apartment versus a multifamily traditional apartment building?
I think you would choose to do that because they're very popular and they're very inexpensive relatively. So I can tell you that the Urban Land Institute did a whole publication on microhousing and indicated that in terms of when you have a building with all different types of units, that the microhousing units were right up there as being some of the most popular. People are interested in and view this as more, again, per square foot cost may be more, but because it's so small, it costs less. I think it's important, and well, there are two thoughts. One is that people have already come to Kenmore, so there's already an interest. We've already seen that. So the development community is thinking it would work here. And then the other point that I wanted to make, the problem in Seattle was not so much, I think, a concern about microhousing units. It's about where they were being built. And it was a regulatory loophole that had been found related to the definition of family in the city of Seattle, which was allowing these units perhaps in an area that maybe would allow 4 units to in fact build 32 micro units because there were only 4 kitchens. So it wasn't that that the units themselves were a problem. It's the where they were being constructed. But so that's what generated the controversy. So what I can say is that they are popular. They're being built in a lot of communities. People have already come to Kenmore, despite the fact that it's more of a suburban nature, asking about building them, and that the controversy in Seattle was not that there's something inherently wrong with a microhousing unit. It's the regulatory loophole that they used to then build it in a low-rise 1 zone where you should have had 4 and now you had 32 units.
So if I understand, come to the right conclusion here, what we're saying is once you take the zoning issue out of this and make it zoning neutral so that you're not in a position where a developer has happened in Seattle where they can come in and take advantage of a lower cost zoning and basically build multifamily in what was not really truly zoned to be multifamily. Once you take that out and make the zoning neutral, it's a design element. And so what you're saying is developers want to develop a housing unit that's going to be more attractive to particularly a certain segment of a population.
Correct. Yeah, it's essentially a very, very small studio apartment. And because it's so small, then it is less expensive.
Deborah, you had your hand up.
Yeah, and I don't know where
Unless
this...
you want to withdraw it.
Well, I don't know where this fits in the conversation, but I was having some difficulty kind of definitionally, if that's a word. I mean, as you said, these are very small studio apartments. Mm-hmm. So are they studio apartments or are they efficiencies? Co-housing was mentioned. I had put that on my list. how are they different if they don't have a kitchen from an SRO? A congregate residence was also a term, a rooming house. I was getting kind of lost in the vernacular, and what are some of the,
Okay,
I don't know where that fits.
so
in the
none of
conversation.
those terms are in our code. Those are terms that have been used in other places. Redmond calls microhousing units SROs, single-room occupancies, because, and I am not completely familiar with whether they are or are not requiring a kitchen, but if you have a unit with a shared kitchen, that could be a congregate residence, it could be a single-room occupancy with a shared kitchen.
And are all of those considered microhousing then, or
Yeah,
is
they
this
all
a
could
big-
be.
Okay, this is a big umbrella term.
Right,
then.
correct.
Thank you.
Correct. Yeah, they're no
Okay.
different from those things, but different places are calling them different things.
Okay.
So the
The
proposal...
size is the defining feature, that it's very
Okay.
small.
Okay.
Go ahead, Carol.
So how does micro-housing differ from hotels?
It's because it's long-term housing.
So it's a long-term housing.
Right. I mean, a hotel generally is a
Short-term
transient,
stay,
right?
yeah. Are they purchased or are they
No,
rented?
they're generally rental.
So there could be, long-term as opposed to short-term. How would you define that? Is long-term a one-year lease as opposed to?
I probably wouldn't define it. It depends on how it's being rented. I think on the face of it, if you looked at something like that, you would be able to tell the difference between a hotel and an apartment building. It's basically an apartment building.
Right.
So many apartment buildings have leases, but they don't all.
Right.
And the idea is that this is your home, this is your abode. You're not staying here in a transient capacity.
Are there any studies about how these micro-housing units affect a neighborhood in terms of, growing retail or crime or anything like that?
No. I would say that there are demand studies, and the ULI report actually might be very useful, that talks about who is demanding the units and what the issues are. I read one article, I think it was in Atlantic Monthly, where someone was saying, "Ooh, are we making people live in these little tiny apartments, and is that a health issue? Is this the new tenement?" I read an article that raised that question and said maybe it's too noisy and it's too small and we're stressing people out. So that certainly is a perspective. But I think generally that, to me, again, it feels like a small studio apartment. I don't know that there'd be any more reason if it was a building full of singles versus a building full of studios with one person, some and two people in. And I mean, I can't sort that out in my own mind about why there'd be a sociological difference.
Angela.
I've had a chance to tour the building in Redmond with the city of Redmond at one point, because it was brand new at the time, and from the outside you can't tell at all. Looks like a regular apartment building. In fact, these almost look like townhomes from the outside, and the only difference was that they had less parking per the amount of people who lived in the units. And they talked a lot about the benefits for it, particularly in that area. There are a lot of single people who work a ton, who don't need a full house or a full kitchen or a full apartment. Some people really like the shared communal space because in the cases where they are single, they get to meet other people, just like when you live in a house with, roommates a long time ago. At least in that case, like I would say there was probably no difference. Like you would not be able to spot someone who chose that versus something else. It was just a preference of the way that they live. And then when I lived in Kirkland, we had a set of the cottage houses in our neighborhood, and they were actually beautiful. They were really well kept. They had an HOA, so everything was landscaped all the time. They had shared community spaces, so the houses were small. They wouldn't have been my preference to live there, but being in our neighborhood, it was actually quite nice, and I could see the attraction to it. So I didn't see any downsides to that. I think it was just a matter of personal preference. Could you live in a very small space and not have as much stuff? Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Angela. And Mark had his hand up.
Yeah, I just had a question, and I think you probably addressed it to an extent, but why do you feel the more extensive code changes are the way to go?
I think because there could be some discussion about different standards for microhousing, and parking is the one that jumps out, but it would be a more deliberative look at, for example, the common recreational open space requirements that we have for multifamily. Kirkland, for example, mandates a certain amount of common space. I guess that's kind of feeding into that Atlantic Monthly perspective. Is there a need to say that if you're going to have really small units, you want to be sure that there are some common spaces? Maybe that's going too far. Parking is the one that jumped out at me. For tiny houses, I think addressing the whole RV question and can it be an accessory dwelling unit?
You mean mobile home? RV?
Yeah, a tiny house is currently
yeah, so
regulated.
it's more like a mobile home than an RV, right?
Well, it's actually not regulated the same way. It's on enough of a smaller platform that it is considered an RV versus a mobile home, which although they say it's a mobile home and it comes in, you site it, and that's where it is.
In a lot of ways, okay.
Yeah, yeah. So even just to bring the whole discussion forward, I think it would be useful to call it out as its own use and then look at the standards. That's just my perspective.
Okay. Carol, did you have your hand up?
Well, I also got to tour some of these podments and smaller scaled apartments, although I don't think they were micro housing down in Ballard, but definitely the trend for single dwellers, non-family dwellers, is a more minimal lifestyle, and that's real in our culture. I think my concern in doing minimal regulations, even though that's attractive because we could address it in a stepped up fashion, I think Kenmore has to make a decision about what Kenmore is. And so doing the extensive types of regulations and making those hard decisions up front might serve us better in the long run, because it actually identifies what Kenmore is about, which can be risky, but it also can open it up for a market trend that would serve Kenmore's vision goals.
Okay, I think I saw Mike's hand up.
Yeah, I like talking about both the tiny houses and the apartments kind of in the same conversation, but there might not be one option that fits both conversations, because every time I think I have a choice here between the two, then I think about the other.
They're different.
Piece, and it's very different, right? They're almost exactly different. So that's one point. And a question I had, Lori, was, are we thinking of different property tax treatment for tiny houses specifically than we would for what we might call a traditional single-family home?
No. I mean, I certainly am not. How an assessor would handle it, I don't know, but that's kind of beyond the purview of this discussion. I assume it would be treated as a single-family home if it were site-built, and then if it were allowed to be permanently located on a lot and the wheels covered or whatever would happen, I don't really know how the assessor would handle it, whether they would say it's a vacant lot with an RV on it. I don't know.
Right.
I mean,
I'd
that's
have
a
to think
question I
that's
could
an
ask.
additional consideration to putting it on wheels besides the zoning and the building code issues would be the designation as real property versus personal property or a motor vehicle.
I will ask that question.
Yeah.
Hey, Carol?
The minimal regulations would, I mean, this is what I think about when I think about the mini home or the tiny home is what's preventing somebody from just getting a big container and living in it.
They have.
And they do,
Yeah,
you know, and
absolutely.
it can be a solution for other types of community awareness and problems or whatever. But I think it behooves Kenmore to delve into this topic and do some extensive decision making at this point, not just kind of pretend it's not going to happen and just kind of wait a year.
Mike?
I agree that there is a very distinct difference in my mind between microhousing and tiny houses, and I think we need to take a look at those separately.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically to microhousing, I think there may be some need to look at some regulation here, but I really tending more toward being careful not to over-regulate them, because the real value of this is and the attraction is the flexibility and the creativity that could come in. We want the developer to apply, because the traditional way of doing things is not going to work for the population that's attracted to these, and it's a growing population. So I'd like to see some freedom in there. But to my mind, that has to be within the existing multifamily rules. So your minimal code set, yeah, they've got to start there. If we make some exceptions, parking, we can talk about that. But I'd be careful not to go too far in the regulation side. To me, the big thing here is going to be the neighborhood compatibility issue that you brought up. I don't think these are appropriate everywhere. I think that's the big complaint that you mentioned already in Seattle. So I know in your recommendation you talked about allowing the micro-housing, the apartment version of this, where we've already zoned for multifamily. So one of the pieces of information I'd like to have is just re-look at the map and say, where is that? Because I don't have that in my mind. So we've made a significant number of changes, particularly as we went through our last zoning and the regional business zone. So I'd like to understand where these could go, and then if you have a list of what you think the regulatory changes, the beyond minimal standard, what those look like, it'd be nice to look at that list.
And just for clarification, I know you said something, but there's kind of two ways of looking at it. One is to incentivize it. Would incentivizing be a minimal look at it, or would it be that more regulatory extensive look? I guess it would depend on...
It would. I think the point that you've made about doing the two things differently is important.
Okay.
I think you could perhaps maybe not incentivize, but certainly support microhousing if you looked at the parking standards. There have been a number of parking studies that show that but again, in places like Seattle and San Francisco, that show that one car per unit is even more than is needed. There were traffic studies done for the Redmond microhousing projects, and I think they settled out at a little bit less than one for parking. So that may not be much of an incentive, but it's a way to say we recognize that this is a different kind of housing unit and that you don't have to comply with maybe as strict a rule because of the size of your unit. Tiny houses, on the other hand, you probably could do, I guess even making them legal on a lot for some period of time is quite an incentive. Mm-hmm. So that's what I kind of meant by incentivizing for tiny houses.
Okay, that helps.
Okay.
Mike?
Yeah, I was just thinking we might already have an example of the micro-housing in Kenmore. At Bastyr University, the new student housing development behind the school are designed with communal eating facilities.
Right, it's very similar. Yeah.
And I don't know how that's zoned or if there's an exemption for educational.
It's an accessory use to the university. So a dorm is an accessory use to the college. So those when it went through the master plan process, and the dorms actually had to go through their own permit at about the same time as the master plan, but they were considered, the land use was dormitories and associated with the college. But certainly a dorm is very similar to a microhousing project. The difference is probably that not all people who live in a microhousing project are focused on a single institution and related to that institution, and they're there for the year, as academic year, that kind of thing. It's kind of a different relationship.
Right. The good news is they've been there 4 or 5 years, and we're all still alive. So
we live to tell about it.
Tell about it.
So far, so good.
Wow. It's a bold new world. Okay. One of the things I like about this whole concept is that it does provide an affordable housing option, and it addresses a segment of the market that has probably the most trouble finding their own housing, finding permanent housing. I think in the right place. It's really well suited to transit-oriented development, which we've already proposed and passed for our regional business zone. It's certainly well suited for that, in my opinion. So I'd like to explore it further. So, do I hear a motion?
Moving.
Well, I'm sorry?
What, on what?
Whether we go with the less extensive or more extensive analysis of the issue.
I'll put forth a motion. I move that we separate the discussion between the micro housing and the tiny houses, and that we consider more extensive code changes when it comes to the tiny houses.
I second that.
Discussion? So, Angela, your motion proposes to do a less extensive analysis of micro-housing and a more extensive analysis of tiny houses?
Actually, I specifically didn't say that because I was hoping that we could further discuss it and then come to a determination whether we need more extensive or minimal code changes. But I know for a fact that I think we will want more extensive code changes to tiny houses specifically.
So the motion is, I've got to rephrase this, or I got to phrase it correctly, to distinguish between micro-housing and tiny houses and to engage in more extensive analysis of tiny houses. Is that right? Okay. Any other discussion?
So in a way, are you prioritizing those two different ways of looking at housing in any way? How I would look at that is, if you're not doing as extensive regulation on micro-housing, that would move forward more quickly than tiny housing, because you'd have to do more extensive regulations on it. It would take more time. Is that how you're thinking of that in your motion?
Either way, this is going to be a follow-up conversation, right?
Correct.
Okay. We could address it that way. I think that would be fine.
I think it might help, just for clarity, to say that what I would anticipate is, after hearing from you all tonight, and then we can still go through the issues, and I can maybe get just a sense from you about the issues, then we would actually move to draft code language and a proposal, maybe very draft, about different ways we could go with these issues. And then at that point, the commission could certainly say, too far in this direction, don't go so far in this direction, or whatever. I would not separate the projects as they moved forward to the council. I think whatever the recommendation is, that it would go forward in a single package to the city council.
But in a way, your motion is prioritizing one over the other in terms of how much regulation there is.
Sounds like it.
Is that correct?
It's too early for me to say without having the full discussion about it. So I think right now I'm just moving to separate the discussion between tiny houses and micro-housing. And then depending on our conversation, we'll determine how extensive those code changes are for each.
So my question is, and I'll get you a mic here, Lori, do you think it's more efficient to go about it that way? For us to look at these separately?
It's fine. I mean, we can discuss them at the same meeting. We may just take them in two parts. Now we're going to turn our attention to microhousing.
Right.
And if, for example, you decided that you were interested in more complicated regulations for tiny housing, we just spend more time with it. It's fine to bring them forward together.
I guess I do support your motion, we should look at these separately, but I really feel uncomfortable being too prescriptive about what we're really putting into this motion, because I think we do have a lot of more information and a lot of questions, and you seem, at least in my reading of your options out here, you're asking us to give you some direction about the approach you should take, and I just don't feel comfortable that we know enough information, I know enough information to say that, so it may even be premature to have a motion of any kind here, beyond just separate your analysis into two pieces, but give us that analysis and then ask us again.
Okay, so we have a motion on the floor. Angela, do you want to amend, or is there any, because there's been discussion about the content, or do we just want to go ahead and vote?
I could amend it to, I move that we discuss tiny houses and microhousing separately with no detail as to the extent of the code changes.
Okay, so the motion is now, we discussed the two topics, microhousing and tiny housing, as separate issues. Do I hear a second?
I'll second.
We have 2 seconds. All right. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
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 All opposed say nay. Any abstentions? Motion carries.
Okay. Given that, it would help me if we could go through this series of issues. I'm not looking for motions, or I'm just interested in discussion and feedback, so I maybe can get a sense from the Commission about your thoughts. You've already given me some thoughts about micro-housing apartments staying in areas currently zoned for multifamily, needing more information on where that is, for example. But the first issue is, where are these housing types appropriate? And we want to discuss them separately. So why don't we, does anybody have a different perspective on where the micro-housing apartment types are appropriate? I heard TOD and I heard multifamily.
Any other comment? Yes, Deborah.
As long as it's kind of true multifamily, kind of with the, you know, where you already talked about, well, 4 units, that's technically multifamily, but, and I don't know if we have anything like that, 4 units on a, you know, zoning for 4 units. I think what we're talking about is where there's already significant
R12, R18,
yeah, exactly,
R24.
Exactly.
Yeah. We don't have a, like an R6.
We don't have an L3 or
Oh, yeah.
L2.
No.
Oh, go ahead, Mike.
Question specific to tiny houses and on residential lots. One of the questions I had to be answered in the future is, most of our single-family lots are either R4 or something
R6.
R6. How does that work with tiny housing? Does that change, or we keep it the same? So what's your assumption?
Yeah, my assumption was that the lot sizes would not change.
So we could just build a smaller size. We could change the regulation to a smaller house on a
And there's, you know, we can go over the building code rules in more depth, but you can already build a fairly small house on a lot. It's just that if you really want to make it tiny, then it has to go on the trailer and be considered an RV because you cannot meet the building code minimums.
Well,
Sorry, Mike.
Yeah, on this issue 1 about location, that is what issue 1's about, isn't it? Where are these housing types appropriate? Okay. You know, the first thing I was thinking about is if this is going to increase density, then perhaps, you know, school boundaries might become an issue, right? If we started to see these more towards one school zone versus another school zone, how would that affect school populations? And then I started to think, well, that isn't really relevant because these don't seem to be family-oriented designs. But that got me to my next thinking, which is, do we have anything in our building code on number of residents per square foot? I don't think we do. So if some family unit was to rent a micro-housing apartment with 3 kids, could a pair of adults, a husband and a wife, for example, with 3 children, live in 250 square feet?
I don't know if the building code speaks to that. Certainly the zoning code does not. That would be a a personal preference, I guess. The issue of density, the density would not be affected because unless the Planning Commission wanted to go in a different direction and say that you could do something more dense if you were doing microhousing. The current approach would be that the microhousing unit would be considered as any other unit, and if you could do 12 per acre under current zoning for a 1 or 2 or a 3-bedroom unit, you could do 12 per acre of a microhousing unit, and it would just be a smaller building. So the density is not impacted unless the Planning Commission were specifically to say, excuse me, because these are smaller, they should be able to have a higher density. And that could be an approach. It wasn't one that I had thought of.
But that might be another, the issue of occupants per square foot may be a future issue for us to consider, right? When we visualize microhousing, I think we think of the young professional or the retiree that's comfortable in making a lifestyle choice to live in 300 square foot. We might not think about the fixed income person with a family of 6 living in 300 square feet. And what is the city's responsibility around that? I know it's still a choice, but is it a choice we want to?
Can we regulate that?
Right.
Well, I suppose you could change the definition of family somehow for microhousing units. I've never seen that in the codes that I've looked at. I've not seen anything like that.
I think
there may be some sort of basic occupancy standards in the building code, and I can look at that.
That'd be nice.
I don't
don't
know if there is in the building code. I think this is governed to some extent by federal law. I think HUD has regulations on the number of occupants, or at least the number that a landlord can limit into a certain square footage and the number of bedrooms. And it's not a simple formula. But I think the city might be preempted in setting its own rules about occupancy, and that HUD might control in that area.
But it might be worth looking at just so we know. I mean,
Yeah,
that
agreed.
information would be helpful, because if there is already a provision to protect a resident from being overpopulated in microhousing, nobody would probably mind you looking into that.
Yeah, I'll check on it.
I think, for
Definitely.
starters, I think Seattle has a regulation. To the extent it's not preempted by federal law, then state and local jurisdictions can set their own standards. And I think, at least in Seattle, if not a federal rule, is that 8 unrelated people can occupy 1 living unit. Is that right, Debbie?
That's right. That's currently how the city has defined family as well. It's
Right.
consistent with that. So there is federal law.
But that's a different standard
Than
than
square
the square
footage.
footage limitations.
Yeah.
But-
So we have that same 8 unrelated people can be a family, or as many people as there are related people can be a family.
Right.
And they can occupy a dwelling unit, but it doesn't get to the question of,
Square footage.
I think that's a building code issue, and I think there may be occupancy limits.
So, yeah, I agree with Carol. It's something that would be helpful to know.
Okay.
I'm just thinking about London's Lower East Side, or, historical dilemmas that take place when you're overpopulated in buildings that weren't designed for that many people.
Right.
And, I don't think that's going to happen in Kenmore, but you
It would
just
be
have
nice to know what the rules are.
It'd just be nice.
Okay.
Deborah?
So I know we talked about dividing the discussion, but I also heard us already talking about tiny houses under this. Have we jumped to that at some point? Because I know there was a comment a few minutes ago about it, under this issue 1.
We were talking about both because when these issues were put together, there wasn't a split.
Right, okay. So if we're talking about tiny houses, I know there was some issue around them being, and I can't seem to find it in the issues here, whether they can be an accessory dwelling unit. So if there's already an existing dwelling on a single-family lot, I assume that's what that means, right?
Correct.
Could you have a tiny house, a mobile tiny house on there? That was the only thing out of all of these that I kind of felt uncomfortable with. And I don't know whether anybody else shared that discomfort.
Why did you feel uncomfortable?
We'll go with Mark.
Well, I just wasn't it true that we currently allow, what are they called, mother-in-law units? Isn't that the?
Right, we already allow accessory dwelling units.
So this would be at least theoretically regulated differently?
Uh,
Or is
it-
that to be determined?
That would be determined, but presumably you could allow a tiny house on wheels as an accessory dwelling unit if you were comfortable with that.
So can you, sorry.
Carol, and then I'll get to you. Go ahead, Carol.
I'm just curious why you were uncomfortable. What were you thinking about?
Oh, I can address that, but I mean, the accessory dwelling unit, currently, aren't those attached?
Not
to the house?
necessarily.
They're not?
I think-
Oh, really?
I believe
Okay.
there's a.
And so can any, I don't know the regulation, obviously. So,
I think there's a minimum lot size that you have to have if you have a separate mother-in-law apartment detached.
detached, yeah.
Detached, but if it's within the dwelling unit in your basement or
Right,
something
'cause
like that, it's different. But
Yeah,
I don't recall off the top of my head what that lot size is to have a detached one, but I think there is a size.
I'll bring
Yeah,
back that information.
Yeah, I think that whatever that is, that regulatory environment, I think that would be helpful for this discussion, because I'm not clear what that kind of physically looks like when I have the good fortune of being in a neighborhood that, is a pretty low density. And, even when it's very obvious, even when somebody's having somebody live in their RV for any extensive time. And so I guess I was thinking, this would be a permanent thing that looks kind of like that. And so that answers your question.
Okay, so you were thinking
Why I
more
was like,
aesthetics.
Yeah, I mean, it's a house on wheels. It's very much like an RV. So, yeah.
Anybody else? Mike?
As we're talking about the tiny houses, my concern is similar to what you said, but specifically, I'm interested in if we're going to change the regulation so that these my hope is we'd be changing the regulation so that these homes would fall within the same rules as an accessory dwelling or a single-family home, so that in terms of the construction standards, that those would be regulated in the same way. I'm concerned about what's the utility, sewer, water hookup involvement in these. If they have the same regulation of 4 to 6 per lot or acre, then that's less of a problem. But I guess the question is, are we thinking about these as a smaller single-family dwelling, or is it something else? I'm thinking that we ought to be looking at this as a alternative to a larger single-family dwelling, in which case it ought to fall into those same regulatory standards. And I'm also thinking about we need to close the loophole that allows these dwellings to escape those rules by putting them on wheels, which is, it's a sham to begin with.
The problem is that we can't. They're state rules. So until the state changes its rules, we cannot permit them in the city unless they are on a trailer with wheels, if they're of a small enough size. Because if they don't meet the building code minimums, you can't build it. You can't build it on a site if it doesn't meet the building code minimums. So the only way to permit it is to allow it on a trailer.
Today. Yeah, but what we're talking about is changing a rule that says that you have to meet the minimum standard.
And we cannot change the state rule.
Can't keep them from putting that on wheels and opting in.
We could let them stay on wheels and put standards around it. But, and again, certainly there are tiny houses that would meet the building code rules that could just be built on a lot. And we don't have any restrictions on that. We don't have a minimum. Some places have a minimum size. Your house has to be a minimum size. We don't have that.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but somebody could build a tiny house permanently affixed to the lot and meet the building code requirement, the state building code requirements?
Depending on the size.
Right.
There may be cases where they could. For example, if it was a 350 or a 400 square foot home,
Right.
it might be able to meet it.
It's a sort of tiny house.
Right. For really tiny ones, 196 like that one we looked at, I don't think that
Can't meet
meets the
code.
building code. And
Has
we
to be on
can't
wheels.
change the building code until the state changes the building code.
Okay.
So we could only permit it if we allowed it on wheels. And you saw how some of them basically parked it and covered up the wheels and said, this is my house. But that does raise issues of utility connections and that kind of thing.
So, just to finish that up, if I understand what you're saying is that what you're proposing to do would be to write regulation for these tiny houses that are on wheels that would bring them into similar compliance with if they were a freestanding home on a lot.
I think it's worth looking at. Yeah. I think that probably from my perspective, the utilities are the kind of the critical issue.
Right.
So just for my clarification, if you have a single-family lot, is there anything keeping a lot owner from having several of these tiny houses on wheels if they have room for them?
Yeah, because you can have one dwelling unit per lot.
And one accessory dwelling unit? Or can you have multiple accessory
You can
dwelling
only
units?
have one accessory dwelling unit.
Okay.
If your lot is big enough. So I suppose if you lived in one and if the rule said you could have an accessory dwelling unit, you might have two. The notion of having more of those is more like a cottage housing development, and that's not something we anticipated discussing here. That would be maybe something for the housing strategy plan. That would be a very big change to allow multiple units on a single lot.
Smaller. So this is really directed at those tiny houses and just making a way for the potential of those being allowed into the city, but governing that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Mike?
That's good.
I would not be too quick to say we want to convert all the ones on wheels to built on site or permanent. I can imagine there are some reasons people would want to have these on wheels for the mobility. When you build something that you intend to live the rest of your life in, but you may not intend to live here the rest of your life, you may want to move it.
Exactly.
And it's an RV at that point, and I don't know if there are restrictions on the number of RVs you can have on your property, but theoretically you could have 2 RVs on your property. They aren't accessory dwelling units if they're on wheels.
Yeah, I am not sure. I don't know the RV code well enough to know. I'm not aware of a limitation where you can park them is a issue.
So I think that's probably a question to come back is what are the current rules on RVs in terms of number?
It's not critical. It was just somebody had asked the question of could you have multiple tiny houses on a property, and I think the point today is many of these that are on wheels aren't. They're listed as RVs, so that's not really a relevant point, right? I mean, it's really the question is can they have multiple RVs? And in our packet, you had already provided us information on what the overnighting limitations are on that. Is it three months or 30
Yeah, and
days?
then if you got an extension, you could do it for longer. I do think that if we move ahead in this direction, that I would like to stop calling tiny houses RVs. I just don't think it fits. I mean, we can call them tiny houses, and then we can write rules about tiny houses that address those separately from rules for RVs, because although that is the current approach, we can change how we discuss that in the code.
So I'm wondering, I'm throwing this out to the commission, we're kind of brainstorming here, which is good. A lot of good questions are being raised. Lori's getting guidance. We can continue doing that, but there's some specific questions in this PowerPoint. Do we want to look at the specific questions and sort of go through those or continue brainstorming? Yeah? No? Maybe?
I do have one more question for
Hi, Joe.
clarification.
Yeah.
Because you made that statement, let's quit calling tiny houses RVs. Maybe that is something we need to know. What is the definition and difference of an RV and a tiny home? Is it because the quality of materials in a tiny home are more beautiful and more whatever, more better designed than, I think about, you got the scale of RVs, but I don't think I'd want to live in one, but some of these tiny houses I've looked at, I'm like, I could live there.
Right.
So,
Well, the city created its own definition for RV, and likewise, we could create our own definition for tiny house, trying to determine what are the distinguishing features that make it different from an RV. How should it be treated on a lot? That's part of the reason why I was recommending the more extensive code amendments, just because we could then really craft regulations that relate to what it is instead of calling it something that it's really not. I mean, it's not an RV, but that's the only place we can plug it in right now.
So what was your answer to that? What is the distinction between RVs and tiny houses?
I haven't written it yet. We haven't figured out what the distinction is.
No, I mean in the industry, though. I mean,
is there an industry definition of
No.
a tiny house?
So, well, the industry definition has to do with size.
Okay.
As far as I've seen, I'm not sure.
I was just saying, it's not a vehicle.
Right.
It's a trailer.
Yeah,
Right. Right. And in Kenmore, RV includes trailers, so that's how the connection is made. But I have not seen a specific definition that talked about, the making of it and that kind of thing.
So basically, we are in a fluid situation where the trend is in some states and municipalities, they're making a way for tiny houses. But nobody has an industry standard definition of what that is. It's fluid.
Beyond size, I haven't seen anything.
Okay.
So we have 4 issues, each of which contain multiple questions, and we're on issue 1. And it's 8:57. So,
well, I would say I think I've heard responses in a number of ways to issue number 1, certainly.
Yeah.
And we can look at issue number 2. Where we haven't really discussed some of the, we've talked a little bit about this, about whether it gets to the whole occupancy question that Mike raised about how many people can you have per square foot. So we've touched on some information we need to address that question, and then I had raised the question of common spaces, so that certainly is something we could investigate.
Comments on issue 2, Angela?
For the tiny houses, as part of the definition, I think a size would be helpful. Understanding when it's not considered a tiny house,
Deborah?
Yeah, and a tagline to that, when do those state standards apply? Sort of what's the threshold there?
Else? Mark?
Well, I was thinking, just answering the sort of question directly, I would say I'm not sure there should be a minimum size, nor really a size of the common spaces be regulated. I mean, it would be helpful to know what what the industry standard is, but.
Okay, I can provide one jurisdiction. I may even have had it in here, but Kirkland may have had rules about how much size of common spaces, so we can look a little bit more at that.
Anybody else? So issue 3, should microhousing apartment units be required to have a full kitchen? Staff recommends against. Any comment? Angela?
Well, I agree. I don't think they should. I think this is one of those things that Mike was talking about, which is we should minimize the regulation on this. I think this is where they have creative freedom.
Okay.
Seen head nodding.
So basically, that means that the market will drive that discussion.
Right.
Just maybe,
Go ahead, Mike.
not specific to kitchen, but I think related, I would want to make sure that in whatever zoning rules we have out there, or construction standards, that sanitation is taken into account.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, you could take out the kitchen, but you're going to have adequate water, ventilation, things of that nature. I'm assuming that if we're meeting the multifamily or standard, you're going to be doing that, but I want to be careful that there may be a higher standard for these very small units, because people are going to eat there, in there, so they're going to have microwaves, they're going to have other sorts of things, so there's going to have to be some sanitation standards that maybe it's not any different, but that's in the back of my mind.
Okay, anything else on issue 3? Okay, issue 4, I'm sorry, Deborah?
Well, I would like to agree with you, Mike. However, having lived in many rooming houses in my younger days, I can't imagine what those sanitation standards might have looked like. But, you know, so I just, and if this is an umbrella term for many different, I mean, that's where I'm struggling. But,
Well,
yeah.
interestingly, and I didn't think of it in this context, but in the new City of Seattle rules, they actually are requiring a sink outside of the bathroom.
Yeah.
In microhousing units. Now, whether we would consider that a kitchen, I mean, it gets to the point.
But it does cover the health standard that
Right.
there be a separation between a clean sink and a dirty sink. Whatever.
Clean.
Yeah,
We
right.
can't regulate cleanliness.
All right,
That was my.
anything else? Issue 4, Laura, you want to read that?
Sure. Other development standards that should be addressed, either for tiny housing or microhousing, and we've talked about several things here. That certainly the public health issues, and we talked a little bit about the parking and whether there should be a sort of common space, recreational open space things. So unless you have different perspectives or other items that you think should be thought about or taken up.
Anybody?
Well, Mike mentioned utilities, that's going to be included, right? Or is that a development standard? Provisions
it
for
could be.
utilities?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess when we're talking about tiny houses, I would lean toward having similar standards for tiny houses as there are for a single-family dwelling. I recognize now that it's okay to have it on a wheel. What I was looking for, how do you manage the distinction?
Yeah.
And so I think moving toward the use, if you have a wheeled trailer, vehicle, whatever this is, that's used as a housing, permanent housing, then it ought to follow the rules for other permanent housing. If it's going to be moved around periodically or used as an RV, then it ought to be. So when you're thinking about trying to develop the distinction between what is an RV and what is a tiny house, I would lean toward what is the use. And that would be the regulatory direction that I would go for there, and then look at what, if it was if the use is similar to a single family housing, then the regulatory piece of that ought to be similar as well.
So I wanted to comment that the staff recommendation in response to issue 4 strikes me as making a lot of sense. And I think that applies to the micro-housing rather than the tiny house.
Right.
Anybody want to object, agree?
I agree.
Okay, looks like we have agreement.
Okay.
Anything else? All right, that satisfies the staff presentation on that element. Anything you want to add, Lori? Or any questions about what we've brought up?
No. So what I would anticipate doing is just realizing that there have been a lot of questions raised, and what I would expect to do at the next meeting would be to come back with more background information, sort of targeted to the questions that have been asked, and maybe some preliminary, if not preliminary code recommendations, then preliminary code options to think about for these. And I'll separate. I guess I could ask, are you comfortable discussing both topics on a single night, or do you really want them like different nights? It would be far easier if we could do it the same night and fill in an agenda.
Any comment on that?
I think they should be combined I think they'll naturally divide into their different uses when you get to that part for whatever the topic is. But I can see your reasoning to keep them together because it's an issue you want to present to the city council at the same time with, there might be some different recommendations for each side of the equation, but they're similar.
Yeah, I can make it 2 agenda items. But
I would
they
do
just
that, yeah.
meet
Yeah.
The same night.
Yeah.
Maybe we don't get to the second one, then it doesn't de facto become 2 separate meetings. Mark?
I just want, are the 2 options that you're proposing for the, sort of level of regulation, are those an either or? I mean, is there is there a spectrum? I mean, do we really need to do 1 or 2? I'm just
No.
I'm just
And
wondering if there maybe are other ways to sort of consider that as we get more, more into it.
Right. I think that was kind of Angela's point, that there maybe is not enough information yet to decide whether you want to go the extensive way or no, we want to keep more in the current scheme of things. So, and I think the notion of separating them and treating one way and the other another way is perfectly fine.
Okay.
So what's our anticipated schedule for addressing and presenting this issue to the council?
Well, I would expect that we would discuss it in September, and that depending on how those discussions go, if we move through it quickly, we could have an early October hearing. I don't think that I'm sure there are not comprehensive plan amendments associated with this, so we don't have an end of the year deadline or anything like that. We're working in tandem with the tree wind throw thing, so that'll go to hearing first, and this will go to hearing at a later time. So this fall, maybe by November, we'll have something, and then it'll just be if we can get on an agenda.
And it's not, as you said, a comp plan amendment, but is it subject to a public hearing?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Anything else? Looks like we satisfied this element of the agenda. The item on the agenda is cancel all regular commission meetings for the month of August. That seems to be the staff recommendation. Any response to that?
Our next one is,
September 1st.
should we vote?
Any objection? No objection? Then it looks like all meetings for August are canceled. Any new business? Anybody want to announce anything? No? All right. There being no new business, I hereby adjourn this meeting.
You could have called a roll call vote on whether to cancel the August meetings.
I want to thank you all, by the way. That was the first time I've been to a commission meeting. You guys did a great job. Thank you. Really.